Warning: the following video is meant for educational purposes only and should not be taken otherwise. Apex Crime Lords does not condone, encourage, or glorify the actions of the individuals covered in this program. Viewer discretion is advised. John Gotti. The name alone evokes images of power, swagger, and untouchability in the world of organized crime. As the boss of the notorious Gambino crime family, Gotti's larger-than-life persona and flamboyant style made him a media sensation and earned him the moniker the Dapper Don. But beneath the expensive suits and charismatic smile was a ruthless criminal mastermind who ruled New York's underworld with an iron fist. Gotti's brazen approach to mob leadership was a departure from the old-school Mafia dons who preferred to maintain a low profile. He courted the media, reveling in his celebrity status even as he ordered hits and raked in millions from illegal rackets. His ability to evade conviction in multiple high-profile trials led him to another nickname, the Teflon Don, as charges never seemed to stick to him. In this episode, we'll take a deep dive into the life and crimes of John Gotti. From his humble beginnings on the mean streets of the Bronx, to his spectacular rise to the top of America's most powerful mafia dynasty, we'll examine the key events and personality traits that shaped his bloody reign of power. We'll explore the inner workings of the Gambino crime family under Gotti's leadership and the massive criminal empire he built. But we'll also see how Gotti's hunger for fame and power would ultimately be his downfall, as his high-profile antics attracted the unrelenting attention of law enforcement, leading to his conviction and imprisonment. Gotti's story serves as a warning about the dangers of being too ambitious and overconfident in the criminal world. So sit back and get ready for a wild ride through the life of the Dapper Don. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born on October 27, 1940 in the South Bronx, New York City. He was the fifth of 13 children born to John Joseph Gotti Sr. and Fanny DiCarlo, both of whom were Italian immigrants. Growing up in a small two-bedroom apartment, Gotti and his siblings faced significant hardships. His father struggled to support the large family on a meager salary as a day laborer and occasional small-time gambler. From an early age, Gotti found himself drawn to the streets more than the classroom. He was a poor student and frequently skipped school, preferring to spend his days running with local street gangs and committing petty crimes. By the age of 12, Gotti was already involved in gambling and had his first brush-in with the law for stealing a cement mixer. Gotti's teenage years were marked by escalating criminal activity and violence. At 16, he dropped out of Franklin K. Lane High School, cementing his path into a full-time life of crime. Along with his older brother Gene and friend Angelo Ruggiero, Gotti embarked on a string of robberies, assaults, and other offenses that quickly earned him a reputation as a rising star in the underworld. Gotti's criminal career nearly ended before it began. At the age of 22, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for a botched armed robbery attempt. But incarceration only hardened Gotti's determination. Behind bars at the notorious Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, he made connections with powerful Gambino family members and began to plot his ascent into the Mafia hierarchy. Upon his release in 1968, Gotti was taken under the wing of Gambino capo Agnello Della Croce, who recognized the young gangster's potential. Under Della Croce's guidance, Gotti quickly climbed to the ranks of the Gambino family. By the early 1970s, he was leading his own crew and pulling in big money from illegal gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, and other rackets. Gotti's early day in the mob were marked by his fierce loyalty to his mentors and his readiness to use violence to advance his position. In 1973, he was allegedly involved in the killing of an Irish-American gangster, James McBratney, who had kidnapped and murdered the nephew of Gambino boss Carlo Gambino. Gotti pleaded guilty to attempted manslaughter for his role and served just 2 years in prison, a light sentence that spoke highly of his growing reputation. As the 1970s progressed, Gotti's power and influence within the Gambino family grew exponentially. He forged key alliances, eliminated rivals, and expanded his criminal enterprises, cementing his reputation as a force to be reckoned with. By the dawn of the 1980s, Gotti was one of the top earners in the Gambino family and a trusted confidant of then-boss Paul Castellano. But Gotti was not content to remain a mere capo. He had his eyes set on the top spot in the family hierarchy, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get there. The stage was set for a bloody power struggle that would shake the underworld to its core and launch John Gotti into the criminal stratosphere. John Gotti's rise to the pinnacle of the underworld was sealed in blood the evening of December 16, 1985. Outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, 4 gunmen unleashed a hail of bullets, killing Gambino boss Paul Castellano and his underboss Tommy Bellotti as they stepped out of their car.
We're working on the theory that there was internal strife within the family, and this may be a matter that is resolved just within that one family. We're working on the theory that possibly he was considered a liability in as much as the pressure of all the cases that are being brought against him and the other families made him a liability and not effective as a leader.
The brazen hit, which was carried out in the heart of the Christmas rush on one of the busiest streets in America, sent shockwaves through the underworld. And it had John Gotti's fingerprints all over it. The unsanctioned assassination of Castellano was a daring power play by Gotti that flew in the face of Mafia tradition. Gotti had not received permission from the Commission, the governing body of the Italian-American Mafia, to take out a boss. But he was betting that his charisma, earning ability, and a groundswell of support from younger, more aggressive members of the family who were dissatisfied with Castellano's leadership would allow him to get away with it. Gotti's gamble paid off. In the vacuum of power following Castellano's death, he quickly moved to consolidate control, positioning himself as the new boss of the Gambino crime family. The Commission, faced with what had already been done, and impressed by Gotti's guts and money-making skills, ultimately accepted his rise to power. As the new head of the Gambinos, Gotti ushered in a new era of leadership that was brasher, more visible, and more media-savvy than anything the American Mafia had ever seen. Unlike the low-key Castellano, who had preferred to operate in the shadows, Gotti seemed to relish the spotlight. He cut a stylish figure in his hand-tailored suits and silk ties, earning him the nickname the Dapper Don. He frequented trendy restaurants and nightclubs, rubbing elbows with celebrities and power brokers. And he cultivated a Robin Hood-like image in his old neighborhood, sponsoring holiday meals for the poor and throwing lavish firework displays. But beneath the polished veneer, Gotti was a ruthless and demanding boss. He ruled the Gambinos with an iron fist, accepting no dissent and unleashing violence against anyone who dared cross him. Gotti centralized power to an unprecedented degree, requiring even his capos to get permission before making any significant moves. Under Gotti's reign in the 1980s, the Gambino family reached the height of its power and influence. With an estimated 500 made men and thousands of associates, the Gambinos had their fingers in every imaginable racket, from illegal gambling and loan sharking to construction fraud, labor racketeering, and extortion. At its peak, the family was pulling in an estimated $500 million per year, nearly $1.3 billion in today's dollars, making it the most profitable crime syndicate in America. Gotti sat at the peak of the vast criminal empire, living like a king off the proceeds of his illegal operations. He bought a sprawling mansion in the upscale Jamaica Estates neighborhood of Queens, wore custom-made suits that cost thousands of dollars, and showered his wife and 5 children with lavish gifts and vacations. Prosecutors would later estimate that Gotti himself was personally taking in as much as $10 to $12 million per year at the height of his power. But even as he reveled in his status as the nation's most famous and powerful gangster, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon for the Dapper Don. His high-profile lifestyle and seeming immunity to prosecution had put a giant target on his back. The media dubbed him the Teflon Don for his ability to evade conviction. But behind the scenes, the FBI was working tirelessly to bring him down once and for all. Gotti, filled with power and pride, seemed to believe his own hype, a critical miscalculation that would prove his ultimate undoing. Throughout the late 1980s, John Gotti seemed untouchable. A Mafia Don straight out of central casting who thumbed his nose at law enforcement and walked out of courtrooms with a debonair smile. The tabloid press couldn't get enough of the Dapper Don, a camera-ready wise guy who broke with the underworld's code of silence to glad hand on the streets of Little Italy and throw lavish 4th of July parties for the whole neighborhood. But behind the scenes, the FBI was tightening the noose around Gotti's neck. Stung by his repeated ability to slip their grasps, federal agents threw everything they had at the boss of the Gambino crime family. They tapped his phones, planted bugs in his hangouts, and leaned hard on his associates to flip and testify against him. At one point, they even managed to sneak in a microphone into the main office of the Ravenite Social Club, Gotti's de facto headquarters. But time and again, Gotti managed to foil their efforts. Mole after mole was discovered and ruthlessly executed. Witnesses suddenly developed cases of amnesia or fled into hiding. The jurors, many of them from neighborhoods where the Gambinos had tremendous influence, proved reluctant to convict. Throughout the 1980s, Gotti racked up acquittal after acquittal, often celebrating with champagne toast and impromptu press conferences on the courthouse steps. Gotti's first major trial came in 1986, when he and 6 other defendants were charged under the Racketeering Influence and Corrupt Organization, or RICO Act, with operating an illegal gambling empire and committing a string of loan sharking and extortion offenses. But after deliberating for less than 2 days, the jury found Gotti and his co-defendants not guilty on all charges. Prosecutors were left stunned as a jubilant Gotti walked out of the courtroom a free man. The case was a major black eye for the government and only fueled the fire of the growing myth of Gotti's invincibility. In the wake of the trial, the media went into overdrive, portraying the Dapper Don as a real-life Robin Hood, a charismatic man of the people who was too slick and too smart for the square-jawed feds. But even as he played the part of the Teflon-coated wise guy for the cameras, behind closed doors, Gotti was struggling to keep a lid on a boiling cauldron of rivalries, betrayals, and festering resentments within the Gambino family. The very qualities that had fueled his rise, his ruthlessness, his ego, his lust for the spotlight, were starting to work against him, alienating key allies and painting a giant bullseye on his back. Other mobsters were increasingly alarmed by the heat that Gotti's high-profile antics were bringing down on the whole Mafia. His reckless disregard for the code of silence and his ability to beat case after case in court had some bosses privately grumbling that Gotti cared more about being famous than being a good business leader. Meanwhile, the lower ranks of his organization were growing restless. The sheer scale and complexity of the Gambino's operations made it difficult for Gotti to maintain the kind of personal touch that had been his hallmark on his way up the ladder. Some soldiers and capos resented his micromanagement and arrogant superiority. Others thought he was getting soft, more interested in hobnobbing with celebrities than tending to the family's traditional rackets. Through it all, Gotti projected an unshakable confidence, dismissing the mounting federal cases against him and the growing discontent in his own ranks. He continued to surround himself with luxury, moving his base operations to the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy and hosting regular meetings of his top lieutenants in the back room. But the very cockiness that had propelled Gotti to the top of the underworld was about to become his Achilles heel. He'd always thought of himself as the smartest guy in the room, an underdog from the outer boroughs who had outsmarted the suits in their Manhattan high-rises. But in reality, Gotti's ego and his certainty of his own untouchability were blinding him to the very real cracks that were spreading beneath his feet. The beginning of the end for John Gotti began, ironically enough, with an act of stunning disloyalty by one of his closest associates. In 1991, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, Gotti's longtime underboss and right-hand man, made a secret deal to flip and become a government witness. It was a shattering betrayal from a man who had been by Gotti's side for decades, through thick and thin. The exact reasons for Gravano's decision to turn rat have long been debated. By his own account, he had grown disillusioned with Gotti's leadership, resenting the boss's swelling and his tendency to throw his weight around without the regard for consequences. Gravano also apparently feared that Gotti was planning to make his son John Jr. Gotti his successor, passing over Gravano for the top spot. Whatever his motivations, Gravano's defection would prove to be the key that unlocked the case that finally brought Gotti down. With his second-in-command suddenly spilling family secrets, the government was able to build an unprecedented case against the Teflon Don, one that extended far beyond the standard racketeering and extortion charges. In December of 1990, FBI agents swooped in to arrest Gotti, Gravano, and Frank Lucasio, the family's consigliere, on charges ranging from illegal gambling and loan sharking to tax evasion and 5 murders, including the execution of Paul Castellano. As the cuffs closed around Gotti's wrist, the realization dawned that this time, things would be different. This time, the odds were not in his favor. The trial that followed was a sensation, a 3-month marathon that laid bare the inner workings of the Gambino crime family in a more vivid detail than ever before. With Gambino as their star witness, prosecutors painted a damning portrait of Gotti as a greedy, ruthless, and violent mob boss who had torn up the Mafia's rulebook in his pursuit of power and celebrity status. Gotti, as always, put on a good show, holding court each day in an array of sharp suits and flashing his trademark grin for the cameras. But behind the bravado, he seemed diminished somehow, his usual swagger replaced by a kind of coiled intensity. As the evidence against him mounted, wiretap recordings of his own raspy voice, plotting murders and crimes, the realization seemed to dawn this time that there would be no walking away unscathed. On April 2, 1992, after more than a week of deliberations, the jury returned with its verdict: guilty on all counts. In a single stroke, the legend of John Gotti, the untouchable Teflon Don, was shattered. The dapper crime boss who had thumbed his nose at the law for so long was facing life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gotti would spend the rest of his days behind bars, locked away in the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois. Under ultra-tight security, it was a humiliating fall for a man who once sat at the pinnacle of power in the underworld, a king in his castle, reduced to just another aging convict in a faded prison jumpsuit. The years that followed were a slow unraveling for the Gambino crime family that Gotti had once ruled with an iron fist. Without its charismatic leader, the organization seemed aimless, torn apart by infighting and power struggles. One by one, Gotti's top lieutenants were arrested, flipping or disappearing into the witness protection program. By the end of the 1990s, the mighty Gambinos had been reduced to a shadow of their former selves, their power and reach severely curtailed. Gotti himself would never see the outside of a prison cell. In 1998, he was diagnosed with terminal throat cancer, the toll of a lifetime of heavy smoking. But even as his body failed, Gotti sought to project an image of defiance. He rejected treatment and endured his final days in jail. So while it's understandable to be drawn in by the sheer drama and style of John Gotti's story, we must never lose sight of the simple truth at its heart: crime doesn't pay. Not in the long run. Not when weighed on the scales of morality and justice. That's perhaps the most important lesson we can take from the notorious life and ultimate end of the Dapper Don. Thank you for tuning in to this deeper dive into one of the most infamous underworld figures of our time. If you found it illuminating, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Apex Crime Lords for more unvarnished portraits of the mobsters, killers, and kingpins who have left their bloody mark on history. Until next time, stay safe and stay on the right side of the law. Because as John Gotti learned the hard way, even the toughest guy in the world can't outrun justice forever.